This is Plant-Based Briefing, Calcium for Vegans, Part 1, by Brigitte Gemme at veganfamilykitchen.com. And I'm Marian Erickson, and this is the curated content plant-based podcast, where I narrate a variety of articles on plant-based and vegan topics with permission in about 10 minutes or less every weekday. And today's article is going to be a two-parter, so I'm reading Part 1 today, and then Part 2 will be tomorrow. From Brigitte Gemme of veganfamilykitchen.com. Brigitte comes from a family of dairy farmers, and she used to love blue steak and blue cheese. And now she helps people decide what to make for dinner, offering whole food plant-based meal plans. Her transition to veganism was a slow one, and she came to it from the environmental perspective. She says that as a good green citizen, she was a big advocate for cycling as transportation, and someone planted a seed when they said to her, if you're fueling that bike with steak, you might as well be driving a Hummer. And the rest is history. After further research, she made the switch, and she now helps others cook more plants. She also runs monthly workshops about nutrition, cooking topics, and the mindset of cooking. She's essentially helping people find joy, gratitude, and mindfulness in the practice of cooking. It's not just about getting food in mouths, as she says. Her book, Flow in the Kitchen, Practices for Healthy, Stress-Free Vegan Cooking, is a must-read for anyone who needs to prepare meals. And it makes a great gift for college students, too, setting them up with a great mindset around the value and ease of making healthy meals at home. So you can check that out at veganfamilykitchen.com, and now let's get to today's plant-based briefing. Calcium for Vegans, My Point of View as a Meal Planner, Woman, and Mother, Part 1, by Brigitte Gemme at veganfamilykitchen.com. Calcium for vegans and plant-based eaters. Should we be worried? Americans and Canadians and some Europeans have repeatedly been told that we need to drink milk and consume dairy products for bone health. Going vegan can feel like a rebellion against the established nutritional order. Are we putting our skeleton at risk by shunning milk that comes from non-human mammals? Obviously, no. However, we must acknowledge that the typical diet of 21st century Westerners often lacks in sources of calcium, other than dairy. For that reason, vegans and plant-based eaters should be calcium aware when making food decisions. In this post, I'll review the importance of calcium for our health, discuss the recommended target for dietary calcium intake, and provide some suggestions to cook and eat in a way that benefits bone health. This post was first published in early 2022. This version is updated to reflect additional evidence about vegan bone health and fracture risk. Notice, I am an educator, meal planner, and sociologist, not a medical professional. I'm educated on the topic of nutrition and trained at critically assessing sources of information, including peer-reviewed publications. This article constitutes my opinion on the topic of calcium and bone health. I encourage you to engage with other legitimate sources of information, including the many listed or linked here. If you have health concerns, please consult with a plant-friendly medical professional or registered dietitian, some linked here. Why does calcium matter? Iron is the most abundant mineral on Earth, but calcium is the most abundant inside our bodies. It is an essential building block of our bones, the individual cells of which are constantly being replaced. Calcium is also required for proper cardiovascular, muscular, and neurological function. The ideal calcium range in our blood is very narrow and constantly regulated by biological processes. If too little calcium is coming in, our bodies increase absorption through the gut and decrease losses through urine. If we still don't have enough to sustain our system's health, we end up digging into our calcium reserves, our bones. Why do we need calcium, and how much should we get? The calcium to build our bones and run our cardiovascular system has to come from somewhere. Every nutrition book insists that dietary calcium intake is important, and surely it is, yet the current scientific literature on the topic is confusing. Official recommendations. Though it fluctuates between countries, the recommended daily intake of calcium is between 1,000 and 1,300 milligrams in North America. In the United Kingdom, however, the recommended daily intake for most adults is only 700 milligrams. China has set the recommended daily amount to 800 milligrams. Bone health is the most commonly cited justification for those targets. What recent scientific studies say. A useful systematic review and meta-analysis published in the British Medical Journal in 2015 reports that, quote, dietary calcium intake is not associated with risk of fracture, and there is no clinical trial evidence that increasing calcium intake from dietary sources prevents fractures. Evidence that calcium supplements prevent fractures is weak and inconsistent, unquote. A 2019 review article in the Medical Journal of Australia also did not support supplementation as a way to prevent bone fractures. However, those are based on studies of developed countries which have a history of dairy consumption. What about emerging countries without a milk habit? The results of a 2016 Chinese long-term study of calcium intake may surprise North Americans. Quote, a relatively low fracture risk is observed in men with dietary calcium intakes of 275 to 780 milligrams per day, and in women with intakes of 250 to 650. And higher intakes may have no further benefit for fracture prevention, unquote. In fact, higher calcium intake, 800 milligrams a day and more, might be associated with higher risk of fracture. A more recent study agrees that the seemingly low calcium intake of the Chinese people may very well be sufficient for their needs. None of the studies above were concerned about dietary patterns like omnivore versus vegan or vegetarian, but there is new evidence arising, and it's not that straightforward. Vegan bone health and calcium intake. A solid 2022 publication based on the EPIC Oxford study showed that vegans were at greater risk of certain types of fractures, notably hip fractures, than vegetarians and meat eaters. The increased risk was specifically for women. The good news, however, is that the risk was neutralized for those with a daily intake of at least 525 milligrams of calcium and a healthy mid-range BMI, 22.5 and above. In the study, connections were also drawn to the vegan participants' lower protein intake and lower vitamin B12 and D supplementation, all of which are bone health factors. In her excellent review article on plant-based diets and bone health, Dr. Shireen Kassam summarizes 2 additional studies with concerning findings. Results from the Adventist Health Study 2 that highlight a much higher hip fracture rate in female vegans who do not supplement calcium and vitamin D, and a paper from the UK Women's Cohort Study indicating that vegetarian and vegan eaters, the study combined vegetarians and vegans, suffer hip fractures more, possibly due to insufficient protein consumption, less than 0.75 grams per kilogram per day, lower BMI, and lower B12 and D vitamin intakes. Dr. Kassam notes that the bone fracture risk for vegans remains a small concern relative to the notable cardiovascular health benefits of a predominantly plant-based diet. You just listened to Calcium for Vegans Part 1 by Brigitte Gemme at veganfamilykitchen.com. And I'm your host, Marian Erickson, and as always, I put a link to the original post in the show notes, and from there, you can find the links to all those studies mentioned as well. And please tune in tomorrow for the second half of this post with specifics about how to meet your calcium requirements eating a vegan diet. And please share this episode with anyone who might benefit, and thanks for listening.